Good, record.
Good to see so many historical people out on a rainy night. Just a word about some of our future speakers. Next month, I'm using this. I'm told I need a speaker. Next month, we'll have another tech professor, Dr. Dina Smith-Laviana, Assistant Professor of Fashion, Merchandising and Design, and Director of the Historical Costume and Textile Collection. And she has helped us, and she helped work on our exhibit. I believe she has.
They're going to open an exhibit, I think, coming up with some of our textiles. I know at least one of our things is going on loan to Tech.
Good.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the dates that it's going to run, but yes.
And she's helped us. And she's,
Yes.
You're talking about design and textiles. That's in March, the fourth Tuesday. No, it's March 17th. Because of Ash Wednesday, we're meeting a week earlier, probably on March 17th. In April, we'll certainly have a change of pace. We'll hear Mrs. Cheryl Sullivan Willis speak about the slavery. She's a descendant of the slaves that over in Mountaintop. And we'll be hearing about that in April. In May, Ted Carroll has written a book about Catawba. So we'll get some history of Catawba. But tonight you came out to hear something about mountaintop coal removal. And Dr. Shannon Bell has come from Blacksburg to tell us about it. She has quite an impressive resume. I wouldn't give it all, that'll take too much of her time. She's an associate professor of sociology and director of the sociology graduate program at Tech. And she says she's working on that right now and will be teaching in the fall. She's written two fine books that won awards. One, Our Roots Run Deep as Ironweed, Appalachian Women and the Fight for Environmental Justice. I believe that's sort of the basis of what she's talking about tonight. And the second book was Fighting King Coal. So we'll learn something about the coal business, but I'm taking your time, Dr. Bell.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's fun to come out on this rainy evening. I appreciate you all being here tonight. So yes, I will be talking about my first book, Our Roots Run Deep as Ironweed, Appalachian Women in the Fight for Environmental Justice, which was published in 2013. And I picked that book for tonight's talk because I'm a sociologist, and so I'm not really I'm sort of studying more living history, I guess you could say. But this book is based on a number of interviews that I did with women who were fighting against mountaintop removal coal mining and irresponsible mining practices in southern West Virginia. And so I thought that sort of was like a oral history in a way, and I thought might be a good fit for this group. So, and I have a number of pictures, and so that's why the lights are dimmed here, but I want you to be able to see the images. So these photographs here were taken in the community of Prenter, which is in Boone County, West Virginia. The dark substance in the water is coal waste that leached out of an underground coal slurry impoundment into the community's water table, contaminating the well water of all local residents living there. This coal waste is also called slurry or sludge and is generated in the process of cleaning coal and is made up of water, chemicals, and a host of heavy metals and semi-metal compounds that can be toxic when ingested or inhaled. The billions of gallons of liquid coal waste that are produced in the coal fields of Central Appalachia are either stored in huge impoundments adjacent to mountaintop removal mine sites, like the picture on the left, or the coal waste is injected into underground abandoned coal mines through pipes like the picture on the right. The coal slurry that's stored in impoundments on top of surface mining operations creates disaster risks for communities living below these sites. For instance, in 1972, a massive coal slurry impoundment collapse in West Virginia sent a torrent of black coal waste through Buffalo Creek Hollow, killing 125 people and leaving thousands homeless. Another example is the Martin County, Kentucky disaster of 2000 that spilled 250 million gallons of coal waste and polluted more than 70 miles of Kentucky and West Virginia streams, killing all wildlife that it encountered. Smaller scale slurry impoundment breaches occur on a regular basis throughout the mountains of Central Appalachia, leaving the fish in most streams in the area unfit for human consumption. The coal slurry that's injected into old, unlined, underground mine shafts leaves nearby communities, most of which get their water from wells, at risk for contamination of their drinking water supplies. Communities whose water has been contaminated with coal slurry from breaches in these injection sites have been found to have high rates of liver cancer, kidney cancer, and brain cancer, as well as gallbladder disease, skin disorders, and even organ failure. Many of the people in these communities at first didn't realize that the brown or black water that was coming through their faucets was actually coal waste. Many were told that they either just had iron in their water or that dirt was getting through their filters. And so people got better water filters and just went on drinking, cooking with, and bathing in this contaminated water for many years, until they, and especially their children, started getting sick. Over the past 2 decades, there have been an increasing number of cases of coal waste contamination found throughout the Central Appalachian region, like the community of Prenter, which I started the presentation with. In 2008, Maria Lambert and other Prenter residents began to suspect that their well water was contaminated with coal slurry from a nearby underground slurry injection site. In an interview that I conducted with Maria, she described the community meeting that she and her parents attended where she first discovered that their water could be dangerous to consume. She told me at that community meeting,
everybody was showing their water, Cherokee Pepper water, and they were talking about the health issues and how to even bathe in. Some people's water is worse than others, and how to bathe in it was causing people's skin to itch and turn red, and how it had bad odor, and how it looked coming out of the water tanks, and the different illnesses, the brain tumors, the gallbladder problems, stomach problems, children's teeth falling out, and all of these things, and it's like a light bulb going off all here, there, yonder, everywhere. And it's like my whole life flashing before my eyes because my children had lost their teeth. My parents had cancer. We had our gallbladders removed, and all of these things it's just like, oh no, it's not just us, it's the whole community. And we're not even blood related.
before I go on, I just want to check, could you all hear that audio okay? Okay, all right. So the weekend after that community meeting, Maria went to the hospital with intestinal bleeding, which she asserts was from drinking the water all summer long in an effort to lose weight. As she described to me, I lost 50 pounds by drinking water all summer long instead of drinking soda. Our water, the water that we should not have been drinking. They tell you, drink lots of water, you know? So when I found out that what I thought was supposed to be a good thing made me sick, I got so mad. As she further reflected,
I never really got that mad about anything, I don't think. I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. It just infuriated me to think that my husband had spent 23 and a half years in the ground. My dad had worked for the mining industry for 25 years. My grandfather worked for about 20-some, 30-some years in the mines. His father was killed in the mines. And to know that they gave their all, everything that they had, they put into that work. I just know that people are suffering, and it's not right for people in power to take advantage of everyday working, tax-paying, breathing citizens. And they're taken away from us and trying to make people believe that they're given to us. And they have made people believe that for 100 years or more, even from the beginning of time. People in power have always abused their power.
liquid coal waste from the cleaning of coal is just one of the many externalities of coal extraction that Appalachian coal mining communities are forced to bear. In this region of the country where more than 1 million acres of land and over 500 mountains have been destroyed by mountaintop removal coal mining, residents suffer higher rates of birth defects, cancer, cardiovascular conditions, respiratory illnesses, and mortality than non-coal mining areas, even after controlling for such variables as income and education. In addition to water contamination, residents living in this area suffer repeated and severe flood events. Oops. What did it? Do you think it just seems to have, I see a red light.
Me too.
Clip, it will feed you.
Darn it.
The computer didn't go.
Any ideas? What's
It
that?
went red.
The computer goes.
No.
Nope. Computer's on.
We're getting to the letter.
Okay.
Hold please.
This has been an epic saga since trying to get this to work.
The coal smoke got it.
The gold, that's right. They knew I was talking about this.
What is he?
He got a pencil.
Well, you know my love. You know my love with this.
I do have a backup projector, so maybe I'll just get that. I am not usually this prepared. I don't know. Somebody just told me I should be today.
My reputation precedes
It is pretty warm up here.
Oh, maybe the light burned out.
me. That's inevitable.
If anyone can read what that little red light. I can't read
Blinking
it.
any light now. It says something, I'm sure it says error or something.
Can you flip a switch and turn it off?
Yeah, it says temp. It's pretty warm up here. Plan B. Sorry.
Pull it out.
This is for AC.
picking up where we left off. Okay, as I mentioned, over 1 million acres of land and 500 mountains have been destroyed by mountaintop removal mining in this area. And in addition to water contamination, residents living here suffer from severe and repeated flood events, respiratory problems from coal dust in the air, and sometimes structural damage and projectile hazards from blasting, sometimes leading to death. Residents of coal mining communities in Central Appalachia count themselves among the ever-growing number of people throughout the world whose communities have been treated as sacrifice zones. These are regions where the people and the resources are exploited to allow corporations and consumers access to cheap electricity, cheap manufactured goods, and cheap agricultural products. In these sacrifice zones, the true cost of energy and consumer products are externalized on the local people and their environment in the form of pollution, destruction of the land, and limited economic opportunities. Most often, the burden of these environmental externalities are shouldered by people of color, low-income communities, and people living in global South nations. The injustices in Central Appalachia have not gone without resistance, however. Over the past 2 decades, this region has become the epicenter of a grassroots struggle for human rights and environmental justice, a struggle that has largely been initiated, led, and sustained by working-class women. The high proportion of women activists in this movement is actually not atypical among environmental justice groups across the United States. Numerous scholars have found that women are heavily represented in both the leadership and the membership of grassroots environmental justice groups, representing upwards of 70% of the activists in local and state organizations that are fighting such hazards as chemical plants, toxic waste dumps, and nuclear facilities. The significant body of social science research has found that across many different movements for social and environmental justice, working class women attribute their social movement involvement to their roles as mothers and grandmothers. The well-being of family and community are often inextricably linked, even indistinguishable in many women activists' minds. For instance, in her research on urban African American and Latino women community workers, sociologist Nancy Naples found that her research participants engaged in what she terms activist mothering, which encompasses an understanding of mothering practices that reach beyond a woman's caring for her own biological or legal children to include fighting against the debilitating and demoralizing effects of oppression in the wider community. Similarly, Patricia Hill Collins reveals the way that Black women's role as mothers in their own families also extends into their position in the larger community as what she calls other mothers. But there appears to be an especially close tie between motherhood identities and environmental justice activism in particular. For instance, Celine Cross's study of the environmental justice discourse of white working class, African American, and Native American activists reveals that across these different groups, women activists' traditional role as mothers serves as a resource for their resistance. The inclination of many women to describe their activism as stemming from their responsibilities as mothers rather than from political concerns may be the result of societal pressures that women face to place their family caretaking role above all else. Despite the substantial literature on women's central role in environmental justice struggles throughout the U.S., I would argue that women's leadership and activism in the Central Appalachian movement has not been adequately acknowledged. While a decade ago, the fight against mountaintop removal coal mining was a struggle largely being fought on the local level, in recent years, the battle has been taken to the national, even international arena. Since 2005, the number of films, documentaries, books, feature-length articles about the impacts of mountaintop removal mining has exploded. Thanks to the smart media work of grassroots organizations working in Central Appalachia, people from across the country and even around the world have heard of mountaintop removal mining and its devastating effects. A number of the individuals who have learned of these residents' fight for environmental justice have chosen to come to the mountains to see the destruction for themselves, many deciding to take on the struggles of local residents as their own. Since the summer of 2005, a movement called Mountain Justice has drawn hundreds of college students, Earth First members, and others from across the nation to help organize protests, direct action campaigns, and educational outreach projects in Appalachian communities directly affected by mountaintop removal. Mountain Justice participants have taken the local residents' stories back to their home communities, helping broaden the base of support for environmental justice movement organizations working in the region. The increasing attention that this movement has received has also come at a cost, however. The coal industry has not stood passively by and accepted these challenges, launching retaliatory campaigns and AstroTurf, or fake grassroots organizations, such as the Friends of Coal, Faces of Coal, and Citizens for Coal. The industry has devoted massive amounts of money and resources in order to convince local residents that being a good West Virginian, or Southwest Virginian, or Appalachian means being loyal to the coal industry. Ultimately, these groups' main strategy is to other the individuals who are participating in the environmental justice movement, labeling them as out-of-state extremists, radical environmentalists, tree huggers, by drawing attention to the outsider support that the environmental justice movement has received and the well-known non-Appalachian figures who have expressed their solidarity with the movement, such as Bobby Kennedy Jr. and actress Daryl Hannah and climate scientist James Hansen. The coal industry works to cultivate an ideology of us versus them, attempting to erase the local residents who are involved in the movement. At the core of the Central Appalachian environmental justice movement, however, are local citizens, and many of the most active and the most vocal local participants have been women. So I wrote my 2013 book, Our Roots Run Deep as Ironweed, in an effort to ensure that the local women who have been at the front lines of this grassroots movement to hold the coal industry accountable are given credit for the absolutely pivotal role that they've played in standing up for Appalachian mountain communities. So this book profiles 12 of these strong, brave Appalachian women to really write them into the history of this movement. And the way I chose to write this book was really a political decision. First of all, I really wanted to provide a venue for local residents from the coal mining areas of Appalachia to tell in their own words how their lives and communities had been affected by irresponsible mining practices. But also, this book is really an effort to contribute to the feminist project of democratizing the research process. So I wanted my book to foreground my interviewees' voices rather than my own voice, so that the women I interviewed could speak for themselves. Throughout the bulk of the book, the middle 11 chapters, I provide each woman's story, as revealed to me through multiple hours of interviewing, as a self-contained narrative with a single voice, that of the activist. I've taken my voice out of the narratives as much as I could, except for a few contextualizing details, which are set apart in a different font so you can tell that it's my writing. I also gave all of the women their chapters and invited them to make any changes that they felt needed to be made before the final manuscript was sent to the publisher. And I will say, there weren't very many changes, but there were a few women who, in recalling some of the things that had happened to them, were so angry that they used some profanity that they decided they wanted to have taken out because their grandchildren were going to read this book. So that was the majority of the editing that they did. Although some of them didn't care and left it in. So I wait until the final chapter of the book to provide my own sociological analysis, which includes a synthesis and an examination of the women's motivations for action, the challenges they faced because of their activist involvement, and the forces that sustain their struggle, in addition to the personal identity transformations that they've experienced through their activism. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm just going to focus on the first of these themes, motivations for action, so that I can bring their voices more into this presentation, I'll continue to incorporate some of the audio files from our interviews into this talk. As I noted previously, there is this large body of research that's found that working class women often justify and attribute their environmental justice movement involvement to their roles and duties as mothers. One of the most prevalent themes throughout my interviewees' narratives is that activism against the injustices of the coal industry is in fact an extension of their identities and felt obligations as mothers and grandmothers. While it didn't account for all of the women in my sample, these findings can be seen among a majority of the women that I interviewed. One example of this pattern is Maria Gunnoe, whose home was severely flooded the night of her daughter's birthday in June of 2003 for the first time. Because of a mountaintop removal coal mine behind her house. The Gunnoe family feared for their lives that night as they heard the sounds of the flood washing away 5 acres of their property, including buildings on their land, their access bridges, and even their family dog, who drowned that night in the flood. There was no safe place for them to go. The mountain above their house was sliding down, and the water around them was rising up, threatening to reach their house. The experience of the flood was so traumatizing that it left psychological scars on Maria's children, especially her young daughter, who Maria told me suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder from the flood. Anytime there was a thunderstorm or a weather alert, her daughter would not sleep.
And I found out one morning at 3 o'clock in the morning it was thundering and lightning, and I go in and I find her sitting on the edge of her bed with her shoes and her coat and her pants. And I found out then what was coming. And that is his putting off. How terrible is this for my child? The security of being able to sleep in her own bed. The companies now own that. They now own my child's security in her own bed. And how can they expect me as a mother to look over that? How is it? What if I done this to our kids? What if I created terror in their children's lives? And that's what it has done to my children. And after all this has taken place, in order for me to be a mother and to keep my children safe and to ensure my children's future as free American citizens, I've had, it's not an option, I've had to stand up and fight for our rights.
Now, while the motherhood identity is a significant motivating force among many of the women that I interviewed, it's important to point out that this motherhood identity is discussed in ways that primarily emphasize a protector duty or role. For instance, in her reflection on why it tends to be women who populate the front lines of the environmental justice movement, the late Judy Bonds told me, quote, "Women are the protectors, the mother figure. They protect their children, they want to protect their grandchildren, and they want to protect their communities." Similarly, Maria Lambert contends it's the need to protect, that need inside of most women, and I would say probably 99.9% of the women have that need to protect somebody, whether it's a husband, a child, a parent, a neighbor, an animal, whoever. Lorella Scarborough further elaborates that this drive to protect is not limited to people, but includes the natural environment as well. She told me, "I'm protecting what I have left, not only my house and land, but the mountain behind it and the environment and the wildlife and the vegetation. I think I'm still a very fierce protector. I don't think that's something that I created. I think that's something that was handed down. The majority of the Appalachian women that I know were born fighting and protecting." So my interview suggests that it's not simply a motherhood identity that motivates and legitimates the activism of many Central Appalachian women. Rather, it's more accurate to describe their activism as stemming from a broader protector identity. This protector identity both encompasses and extends the motherhood identity so that these women perceive that the moral authority for their activism emanates not only from a calling to protect their children and grandchildren from irresponsible mining practices, but also from an obligation to protect their communities, their mountains, their heritage, their family home place, and their way of life. Past research on working class women activists has found that the drive to protect one's children from harm is often translated onto efforts to defend the larger community. This link between family and community is also prevalent among the women in my sample. For example, Donetta Blankenship describes her motivation for activism in relation to her desire to protect the members of her community. She states, "Everybody has a right to live healthy. I'm going to go out and support and help my, I guess you call it, friends and neighbors and communities because they need clean water, they need good health. I'm going to fight against what these people are doing so that my friends and neighbors can have homes and better health." In addition to being motivated to fight for the safety and the health of members of their communities, a number of the women also described feeling a drive to protect the social cohesiveness and relational aspects of their communities, which they perceived to also be under threat of destruction from coal mining. In her narrative, Maria Gunnoe describes the ruination of the town of Whitesville, a town just a few miles from where she lives, that used to be the bustling center of life in the Coal River Valley. She says, Whitesville is an example of what happens when you depopulate communities. The people that lived in Whitesville, say 50 years ago, made that community what it was. Those people were the people that had been there for generation on top of generation on top of generation. The people that was there, the families that grew up there, most of them's left. And there you take the community out of the community. When you take the people out that has been there for generation on top of generation, when you take them out, the sense of community is gone. You take the kinship out of the community, and that's one reason I'm fighting so hard to save it. Each of the women that I interviewed has a deep connection to not only the people in her community, but also to the physical place that she calls home and the way of life that's connected to that place. Protecting home is a strong motive for activism described throughout the narratives. One example is the case of Mary Miller and Pauline Canterbury of Sylvester, West Virginia, who were known as the Sylvester Dustbusters. They became involved in the environmental justice movement in response to the massive quantity of coal dust that was emanating from a coal preparation plant adjacent to their town. Their community was completely covered with coal dust on a regular basis. As Pauline explained to me,
I mean, we could walk outside here on days like today, and the sun was like a kaleidoscope, like you was looking at the kaleidoscope. There was so much coal dust in the air. And I mean, it just plastered our homes. Our homes were just polluted completely with it. And the whole area, you couldn't cook outside, you couldn't do nothing outside. And not only that, then it began to seep through your windows and things that coming inside of your homes. Even yet it does that, because the thing of it is, the coal now is not like coal used to be. Coal used to be lumps, and it used to travel in lumps, I mean, even on your railroad. Now it is crushed into very fine powder, and it can seep in anywhere. And I mean, right now, in order to get all the coal dust out of our homes, we're going to have to take them apart and rebuild them. Because there's no way you can get it all out. There's just no way you can do it. It comes in under your window sills, it's everywhere. Your attics have it, your attics are full of it, everything is full of it.
the coal dust has destroyed their homes and robbed the resale value. As Pauline relates, quote, "You know, it's not easy to sit and watch your home being destroyed, something you've worked for all your life. We found out through our lawsuit, because we all had our homes appraised for it, that our homes have lost 90% of their resale value." Pictured here is Mary Miller's beautiful brick home, which in the 1990s appraised for about $144,000. It's now worth only $12,000. Mary told me, quote, "I just think that's about the worst thing that could happen to somebody, when you see that you've worked all your life for this and are losing what you've loved and worked for. There's no inheritance. There's nothing, not even enough to bury us. $12,000 wouldn't even build a garage, and like I said, it's certainly not going to bury us. If we'd have to go out and borrow money, what have we got to put up for collateral? There's nothing there, nothing." Reflecting on this experience, Pauline told me,
"We're being discriminated against. We're being sacrificed here for energy, for the rest of the world, for more money, for people that already have more than they know what to do with. And it isn't right. To me, it's not the American way. It will never be the American way. It's American vision that we're supposed to be here. It's just for greed. It's greed. You know, why should we give up everything we own for somebody else to achieve energy? For a world of people that's already pampered to death, it's the injustice of it." I was mad because, I mean, I worked hard for my home. I worked under a lot of hard conditions for my home. And I didn't think anybody had the right to destroy it.
Activist Lorella Scarborough also cites the threat to her home as one of the primary reasons that she was spurred to action. As she relates, Massey Energy's Eagle 2 mine permit included a portion of Coal River Mountain that was directly behind her house.
My home's threatened. The family cemetery is threatened. The stream that runs by my house, the deer that I sit there and watch leave across the fence, everything where I am, because of Eagle 2, is now threatened. So I really don't have a choice.
A question that's commonly been asked of Central Appalachian environmental justice activists is, if things are so bad, why don't you just move? To most people from outside the region, moving seems like a logical solution to the problems that many of these residents face. However, as the activists I interviewed attest, many don't consider leaving to be an option, even if they could afford to move. Their attachment to home and community is so strong that fighting back is the only acceptable solution that they see. Lorella Scarborough expresses the intensity of this connection when she remembered how she felt when the vice president of the company Patagonia said to her, "The easiest thing in the world would be to move." She responded,
It wouldn't. That would be the hardest thing to do because that's the house I raised my kids in. That's the house my husband built. He's buried next door. The land that he loves has been in his family for generations. And I can't imagine driving out of the driveway for the last time and leaving in the cemetery and everything else there. That would be the hardest thing to do. It's easier to fight and to try to save all that. Because if I walk away from it, it's certainly destroyed. It's certainly blown apart and destroyed. So it's a whole lot easier to stand there and fight.
and as the late Judy Bonds told me in our 2006 interview, people say that ironweed is a symbol for Appalachian women. You know that tall purple flower that's all over the mountains at the end of summer? Have you ever tried to pull it out of the ground? It's called ironweed because its roots won't budge. That's like Appalachian women. Their roots are deep and strong in these mountains, and they will fight to stay put. These women feel a very deep connection to the physical place that they call home. However, the land is important not only for its physical aspects, but also for the intangibles that it represents. As Lorella further articulated to me, it's difficult to explain the attachment, the sense of place that Appalachians have. It's a connectedness to the land, to your surroundings. It's not the value of the house. It's not the price of the 10 acres. It's the memories. It's what you have there. It's where you've been. It's the life you share with the people you love. Place attachment, what Lorella Scarborough is describing here, is the bond that connects individuals to their environment. This bond is not simply a relationship with the physical landscape. It's also composed of interpersonal, community, and social relationships. As Judy Bonds told me in our interview, it's my soul. It's not just these mountains, it's our culture and our heritage. Thus, just as important as the physical landscape, or perhaps even more important, are the intangibles of culture, history, and community that the land represents. A number of the activists in my research express their place attachment and drive to protect the land through their identity as Appalachians. As Debbie Gerald relates, "We are Appalachian women, and our roots run so deep you can't distinguish us from the earth we live on. It's just a part of us." Maria Gunnoe further explains the connection that she sees between being an Appalachian woman and fighting the injustices of the coal industry.
And the Appalachian women are the backbone behind the Appalachian family. And our Appalachian families are being put in danger. And it's our natural instinct to step up to the plate and say, "Excuse me, but you're killing something I love." You know, and we will fight for it. That is our link to who we are. And it's a link to who our children are. And we can't allow it to be destroyed. As mothers of future generations of Appalachian boys and girls, we can't allow them to steal this from our children and generations. And it can't be replaced.
Appalachian identity is a notion that has been both celebrated and contested within the field of Appalachian studies. Numerous scholars have argued that the geographic and cultural place of Appalachia is actually nothing more than an invention of travel writers, journalists, academics, and capitalists seeking to other the region in order to exploit it. Many scholars have converged on similar conclusions. The rendering of the Appalachian region and people as somehow different from mainstream America has played a large role in its being treated as an energy sacrifice zone for the rest of the nation. As Reed and Taylor assert, the social construction of Appalachia as pre-modern or savage has allowed it to serve as a sacrificial scapegoat for the atrocities of capitalism, normalizing devastating practices like mountaintop removal coal mining. Despite these origins, though, claiming the identity of Appalachian may in fact be a mobilizing and empowering act for some, as it reinforces place attachment, as evidenced by the women activists in my study. Scholar activist Steve Fisher attests to this possibility, stating, quote, "I've witnessed local social justice struggles transformed as participants have come to see themselves as Appalachians." So how can we reconcile the invention of Appalachia with the very real ways in which this identity, both positively and negatively, affects the lives of many people living in this socially constructed region? Ann Kingsolver argues that we should conceive of Appalachian identity as an activity of negotiation rather than something that's fixed or immutable. In other words, Appalachian identity is not something that one automatically possesses by virtue of having grown up in the region. Rather, it's created through social interactions, and as such, it can both grow out of and strengthen local resistance efforts. Indeed, the women that I interviewed draw on their attachment to the place of Appalachia and their Appalachian identity as a source of strength and a motivating force for their activism. They not only seek to protect their children, families, and communities, but they are also driven to protect those aspects of their lives and sense of self that are connected to their physical surroundings, their family histories, and their cultural traditions. Importantly, the protector discourse that these women use could potentially open up a wider space for Appalachian men to find a larger connection to the movement. While relative to women, there are very few local men involved in the environmental justice movement, those who are involved do in fact use similar language to women activists when describing their motivations for action. In particular, a number of the local activist men that I interviewed while conducting research for my larger study express that a desire to protect their communities is their impetus for action. For instance, Bill Price describes a sense of responsibility to the community that I grew up in, articulating feeling an obligation to draw on his professional skills and knowledge for the purpose of helping those who have suffered the effects of irresponsible coal mining practices. Likewise, Ed Wiley linked his decision to become an activist with the remorse that he felt from working for the industry and actually the very coal mine that he thinks made his granddaughter sick. Thus, while my past research has found that the coal mining related hegemonic masculinity or dominant form of masculinity in this region may pose a barrier to local men's ability to enter into the environmental justice movement, those men who are able to escape this dominant masculinity's influence may connect with identities that are actually quite closely aligned with the protector identities of local women activists. Emphasizing this protector responsibility of Appalachian women and men may be a way to attract more local men into the environmental justice movement. This finding has implications for other environmental justice movements outside of Appalachia as well. Men's employment loyalties and the industry-related local masculinity of a region often act as silencing forces among local men. Framing support of the environmental justice movement in ways that emphasize an identity that's shared by both women and men may simultaneously grow the constituency of allies while diminishing the ranks of industry supporters or defenders. Appalachian women have been and continue to be at the center of the environmental justice movement to protect mountain communities. Their power, perseverance, and passion have helped push this movement forward, drawing the attention of people from across the country and world. These women's narratives are stories of empowerment and transformation. Through challenging the coal industry's exploitation of Central Appalachia, these brave individuals are simultaneously challenging stereotypes about Appalachian women's agency and strength. These women, whose roots in the Appalachian Mountains run deep as Ironweed, deserve to be recognized and celebrated as the driving force behind the movement to save their Appalachian families, communities, culture, and land.